Welcome to Journalists Roundtable. I'm Ellen France. Our guests today are Meir Rinde, investigative reporter with Billy Penn at WHYY, Tom Lehman, political reporter with WGAL TV Lancaster, and Carter Walker, reporter with Votebeat Pennsylvania. Thank you all for being here today. As I'm sure you're all aware, Tuesday was an election day here in Pennsylvania. This question's for anyone who wants to jump in. All statewide court Democrats up for retention were retained. What does that tell you about the way that people are feeling about the government currently?
Well, talking to a number of people about this yesterday, there seemed to be a combination of good campaigning, or at least effective campaigning, perhaps, from Democrats to try to get that message out there about retaining these judges, but also perhaps some residual frustration with Washington and the Trump administration and the ongoing government shutdown trickling into those races. Certainly talking to some voters, talking to some of the political operatives around the region here in the Susquehanna Valley where I work, it did seem like there was a little bit of that element there of people frustrated with who's in charge, even though they're not in charge right here.
Definitely, I would agree with that. I spoke with a rural Democrat in Lancaster County on Election Day, and she said that she was very much using the retention vote as a way to express her frustration with President Trump.
Meir, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, in Philadelphia, I think the national environment was a big factor. The turnout in this election was more than double the rate in the primary, which is kind of a remarkable thing. You don't really see that big a shift usually, at least in Philadelphia. And I think our reporters, when they talked to voters at the polls, they were like, I felt like I needed to get out and vote. I needed to exercise my democratic rights in this period when we feel like they're under threat. So I think that was a huge factor. And then plus all the advertising and a couple interesting races.
And Meir, that wasn't just limited to Philadelphia. We saw increased turnout all around the state. I think Allegheny County from 2021 to this year went from 33% to 44%, so pretty big bump all around the state this year.
And I'd add right here in Cumberland County, which traditionally has been thought as more of a rural red-leaning county, but recently starting to see that demographic shift a little bit toward purple and blue, we'll even go as far to say. You saw entire boards have a Republican slate of candidates get wiped out by Democratic challengers. And again, talking to some of these candidates, they said the thing we heard from people voting is that they were tired of what's happening in D.C. They felt that this was their opportunity to make their voice heard.
Carter, do you want to talk about how significant this year's Supreme Court retention was? Yeah,
so we in Pennsylvania do it a little bit differently than other states. Everybody at this point after Election Day probably familiar. Judges run once in a partisan basis, and then we reelect them for another 10-year term, just yes, no. And it's unusual that it would get this much attention. In the past cycles, this has really been more of a sleepy race. Folks don't pay all that much attention to it. But not just in Pennsylvania. Over the past couple of years, we've been seeing a lot more interest in these state-level appellate court races. Wisconsin, I have a colleague there. They obviously saw a bunch of money dumped in to their race this past year. North Carolina last year in the presidential election cycle had a big Supreme Court race that lasted much longer because they were still adjudicating some ballots. But yeah, we saw a ton of effort from the Republicans to push the no campaign and Democrats reacting to that. But I guess the effort on part of the conservatives just wasn't enough to get over that hill.
No, Meir, you wrote about the Philadelphia district attorney race and that Larry Krasner won his third term as district attorney, beating Patrick Dugan in what you called a, quote, wide margin. What stood out to you about this race?
It was an unusual race because Dugan is a Democrat. He ran in the primary and lost to Krasner, which is typical in Philadelphia in primaries. Usually the incumbent wins in almost any race. But then Dugan did a very unusual thing. The Republicans here, the Republican parties and activists have such contempt for Krasner that they organized a write-in campaign in their primary, and Dugin got 7,000 write-in votes in the Republican primary, which is nuts. So, and he decided to run as the Republican nominee after losing the Democratic primary, which the Democrats were very unhappy about. But he ran. He didn't have much of a campaign. He didn't have much money. Krasner totally ignored him in the general election. And then he got crushed, which is not unusual for Republican candidates, whether for DA or other offices in Philly. So it was a little bit of a strange race in some ways, but in other ways, it followed the usual pattern, especially in a strong Democratic year.
You mentioned that some people are very unhappy with Larry Krasner as their district attorney. What are some things that they are hesitant about with him?
Yeah, well, the line that Dugin took, and this is something that many other people have said, is Krasner is an avowed progressive. He used to be a defense attorney. He favors incarcerating people less often, focusing on diversion programs. And there are accusations that his assistant DAs and other staff basically allow people to be released from custody after they've been arrested or charged with violent crimes, and then they go on to commit more crimes. And there have been several notable crimes, including one recently where a woman was kidnapped and killed, where people have argued that the suspect there and others in similar cases should have been held and kept from committing more crimes. So that's been a big one of the big talking points against him. Also, he's been very active on prosecuting police officers and even former prosecutors accused of misconduct, and in exonerating people who were supposedly wrongfully convicted. And so there's some animosity from law enforcement and from residents who are very supportive of law enforcement. Now, the big kind of response to all this is, yes, crime went up a lot in the pandemic. Homicides went up very high in the pandemic in Philly and in other cities. And now they're way down. Now they're at historically low levels. So that's kind of one of the main complaints against him, but it's also perhaps not that effective given the way that the crime trends have changed over the past couple of years.
And Tom, you covered the Harrisburg mayoral race. Incumbent Wanda Williams won again for another term. What can you tell us about that race?
Well, it's funny because we just talked about the Philly DA race, and a very similar dynamic happened here in Harrisburg in terms of a primary candidate going on to then run as a Republican in this race. Wanda Williams, the incumbent mayor, a Democrat, she ended up winning a very close and crowded primary contest between four other candidates she was running against. One of them was City Treasurer Dan Miller. Miller is a registered Democrat. He didn't switch parties, but he did, during the primary, make an effort to get enough people to write him in as the Republican nominee. So he essentially had a rematch, almost like a runoff, against Williams. And between the two of them head to head, he did better than he actually did many years ago when he did a similar maneuver to try to have another shot at the mayor's race against then Mayor almost elect Pappenfuss. But in this case, he ended up having more of a traditional campaign. I would say got within striking distance, but it was still a decisive win for Williams. I think it really showed the value of being the nominee and being the incumbent.
How have people in the city viewed her first term as mayor?
I think it depends on who you ask. Williams certainly has a lot of support from her base and a lot of sections of the city. However, particular neighborhoods like Midtown and Uptown, parts of Uptown, I should say, aren't essentially big fans of her. There's been a lot of questions about her management. She's faced some recent scandals. She was named in a whistleblower lawsuit against her that is ongoing, going to trial next year, as a matter of fact. She was also recently tagged in a state ethics complaint that she moved to settle over use of a dumpster. She was moving out of a home just a couple years ago. But at the same time, the other big criticism for her was the handling of the Broad Street Market, a historic property in Harrisburg that had a major fire that wiped out one of its buildings, and the slow progress on that has really frustrated a lot of people. It's hard to say whether that factored into this being, again, I would say a competitive contest. She did win decisively, but certainly when you look at past results, whether it's write-in candidates or Miller's previous attempt as a Republican to run, that may have played a role in motivating some people to show up and vote against her.
Now, you and Meir both wrote about races where a registered Democrat ran as a Republican to be on the ballot. Is this something that we think we're going to keep seeing a lot of going forward?
I'll just say this. I think it's a maneuver that is not uncommon in the judicial races, I believe, that people can cross-file and certainly appear on both sides of the ballot. There are other positions where that is allowed, I believe. But, when you talk about sort of fraying these traditional partisan lines, this may be an option for people who have deep enough pockets maybe to reach out to people on the other side. The other problem you run into, though, is if you're a Democrat, for instance, and you're just trying to make sure you can have a shot at the general election, if you're actively going out there campaigning, getting people to try to vote for you on a write-in basis or whatever means you're trying to get that nomination, that could be something that backfires in the general if you're trying to get some of those Democratic votes, we'll say, and you're the Republican candidate.
Meir, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, especially in a heavily, heavily Democratic city like Philadelphia, people are not that interested in voting for Republican candidates. I mean, Dugin's decision to run, to accept the Republican nomination, really, he immediately lost a bunch of Democratic votes when he did that. And in fact, when he was running in the primary, the Republicans were out there saying, we prefer him to Krasner, and we encourage people to write him in on the Republican primary ballot. And people were asking Dugin, would you accept this nomination? And at one point he said no, and then he reversed himself. And then Krasner and a lot of other people said, "You're a liar, you're a traitor." We kind of, some Democrats supported you in the primary as a Democrat, and now you're sort of turning your back on them. And he did not do well in the end. So I think this would probably be a disincentive to future candidates. It just doesn't make sense to run that way in Philly because your odds of winning are almost non-existent.
And Carter, you wrote that the number of Republicans voting via mail-in ballot has increased. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I believe the rough numbers in the 2021 municipal election, there was around 160-something thousand Republicans who had requested a mail ballot, and really sharp increase this year up into the mid 200,000s. So a lot more of them obviously getting more comfortable with voting by mail, and that's a trend we've been seeing over the past couple elections. There were a number of years after the 2020 election when many Republicans, leaders, including President Donald Trump, were disparaging mail voting, that really suppressed Republicans' adoption of that voting method. They couldn't really get past making up 22% of all the state's requests. But they kind of softened their tone on that after the gubernatorial election in 2022, realizing that if we want to compete on a statewide basis, we really got to use all the tools at our disposal. And their numbers have been improving, certainly. Still not as much as Democrats vote by that method, but what you'll hear from Republicans is, ideally we do not prefer mail voting. We would like to see it possibly done away with. Many still feel that way, but they recognize that that's a tool that they got to take advantage of if they want to be competitive. And I think we'll probably still continue to see more of that. I think more of their voters, as they use it, will become less adverse to it. And perhaps over the next couple of elections, those percentages will even out to 50-50, a little bit more.
Well, you mentioned their voters slowly becoming more adverse to it, but President Trump did say he wants to lead a movement to get rid of the mail-in ballot. Do you think that they'll follow him regardless of how they feel about it now?
Well, I would say that even though he has been saying that, that is not the messaging you see coming out of the folks who actually have control over that. The local party chairs and the state Republicans, they still very much encourage their voters to go vote by mail. I was fascinated that when I went to check out the state GOP's website ahead of the election, they tell you about the methods that you can use to vote. And the first two were variations of mail voting, requesting your mail ballot or going into the county office and kind of voting in person there with the mail ballot. So even though he says he'd like to lead that movement, it doesn't seem like many other folks are lining up behind him to do that.
You wrote about a case involving voter fraud with voter registration in Pennsylvania. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this was something that happened before the 2024 election. A number of counties around the state, including Lancaster and York, had announced that they received some voter registration applications that they thought looked suspicious to them, had signs of fraud, the same handwriting or social security numbers that weren't right. And so they started investigating that as a criminal matter. It took a little while for us to hear some about it, but the Attorney General did announce charges against 7 folks last month. And what we had written about is that obviously fraudulent registrations are a problem in and of themselves, but these came out of a third-party voter registration drive, which have caused other issues for counties beyond just possibly receiving fraudulent applications. A lot of them will dump a huge batch of applications near the deadline to register, which creates a lot of work. A lot of them have duplicates or just the information isn't filled out properly, but county offices still have to process each of those, which can not only take them away from the myriad of other tasks they have, but can cause delays for those voters who wanted to get registered.
And what can we do to prevent this registration fraud from happening again?
Well, that's tough to say. That's really up to the legislature. But the one suggestion I did hear from a county election director was that some other states had implemented laws that it's illegal to hold on to those voter registration applications till the very deadline. Like you got to turn them in a week after, which at least would, prevent the counties from having to process a huge number of them a week before the election day or whatever it is.
You mentioned the state legislature. Tom, you wrote about how the state budget is now in its 4th month of an impasse. How have local government entities and organizations been impacted?
Well, we can tell you this, particularly at the county and school level. A lot of people are making very tough decisions right now. In particular, just in the last couple of weeks, Dauphin County has said they're kind of putting a slowing, if you will, on their hiring in some cases for some roles, but also some of the school districts in Dauphin County, for instance, where I cover, they're looking at loans. I believe the Harrisburg School District was getting ready to take out a $35 to $50 million loan in order to essentially keep making payroll, in order to continue to actually keep the operations of the school district going. One state senator from the area even said there's one school district, she would refuse to name which one, but they were looking at significant staff reductions potentially happening if they can't get funding soon. And I think when you talk about the fact that we've entered the 5th calendar month, we're not quite at 5 months, obviously, but certainly 4 full ones. We are at that point now where I think a lot of people are wondering, what is the holdup? Why are we still waiting for these dollars? And again, it has a lot of effects: school districts, counties, the nonprofits that get a lot of that money passing through to them for very important services that help some of the Pennsylvanians in greatest need. And I think they're frustrated. They're taking some drastic steps, whether it's taking out debt or making very painful cuts.
The House and Senate both passed their own budget, and it keeps failing in the opposite chamber. What is the reason? Did they say anything?
I think publicly the answer, especially from the Senate Republicans, is we're spending too much money and we have a structural deficit, and we are going to burn through our savings this year, and we are going to really burn through our savings next year to the point that we are going to have to make cuts at the state level, or we're going to have to find more money somewhere. On the other side, the House has said, we think that we need to spend an appropriate amount of money to help Pennsylvanians, particularly as far as education goes. That has been a big sticking point for Democrats during this particular, we'll say, budget cycle. One of the key things, though, about this is if you can't get to a number, and if you're not able to get what you want as far as that particular issue goes, well, then you ask for something else. You negotiate. And it sounds like some of these issues like education funding, Pennsylvania's participation in RGGI on the environmental side may be playing a factor into these negotiations as we again, enter this fifth calendar month without a budget passed. Everyone is really beginning to feel like these negotiations might be happening. They're really important, but on the lower level, we're really struggling.
How has the governor reacted to this impasse?
It's been interesting because Governor Shapiro last week held a number of closed-door meetings with leaders in the legislature. There's been some reporting that this has been the first one, I believe, in months where they've had everybody together sitting down. I watched a couple of those meetings have their assembly and then departures. When it comes to who's involved, it's the leadership in the Senate Republicans, the leadership in the House Republicans, the leadership for their counterparts democratically. The bottom line, though, is at this point, we still haven't heard that there is a deal yet. Shapiro said he spent all summer trying to get everybody to sit around and figure out a deal. But at this point, it seems like we're getting some progress, but how much that it will be remains to be seen.
And you mentioned that school funding is a priority for some of the Senate Republicans. Part of that is school vouchers. And Meir, you wrote about a Philadelphia labor leader who spoke in support of school vouchers. What was the context of that?
Yeah, that was Ryan Boyer from the Laborers Union, and he's actually also now head of the Building Trades Council, which is kind of an umbrella organization for more than 30 unions in the Philadelphia area. Pretty influential guy, helped get Sherelle Parker elected mayor. He's sort of the biggest labor voice in the city right now. And he has been very active on the education front. He says that the Philadelphia schools aren't good enough, and he's worked to create vocational programs for high school kids to get into union work. And he recently was part of a group that got the first new charter school approved in Philadelphia in a decade, I think it was. And he also has allied himself with some conservatives, notably Jeffrey Yass, the mega donor, who has tried to influence some Philadelphia political races, council races, mayoral race, and who has been very active on supporting the idea of using state funding to fund vouchers so parents could send their kids to private schools. So public funding of private education, essentially, which was a big issue in last year's state budget debates, and again now. I think probably that's something that the Republicans at the state level are really pushing for. So Boyer has in the past essentially allied himself with voucher supporters and with charter school supporters, which are positions that are pretty unpopular in Philadelphia. Especially, obviously, with the teachers union, which is one of the other big union organizations, perhaps very high on the list of influential organizations. So there's a split, which you see in other places and at other times between unions in the private sector and unions in the public sector. So I happened to go to a talk that Boyer gave last month at a business luncheon, and he talked about this. He defended his position on supporting alternatives to public education or reform of public education. And he also said, I'm going to meet with the head of the teachers union and hash this out. And I asked him later what this was about, and he said, I might be able to tone down or reverse my support for some of these non-traditional educational options. And then I later talked to the teachers union, and they said there's no meeting set up, so it's unclear what's going on there. But this was an interesting moment where at one moment this prominent labor leader was saying, I strongly support charter schools or major reforms of the public schools, but I might be able to change my position at some time in the future. So we'll have to see how that plays out as discussions of how to improve or how to change Philadelphia's public schools continue.
How important is it that the Building and Construction Trades Council president and the Philadelphia Teachers Union get along?
It's an interesting question. I mean, he is, he has no direct role in running the school district, but there is, I think, a large sort of component of the population of elected officials who are sympathetic to the distress, really, of parents, especially parents in some of the less advantaged areas, poorer areas of Philadelphia, who are like, I don't want to send my kid to the local public school, to my neighborhood school, because the school has very bad outcomes. I really want to have charter schools. And I'm not sure exactly where the mayor stands on that, but you could see her as being on having sympathy toward that position, especially since Boyer is such a prominent supporter of hers. So, and that's directly opposed to what the teachers union is very adamant about their positions. So it's a split. It shows the difficulty of finding consensus on how to best serve the city's children and how to improve the school district in light of all the barriers that people face here with poverty and sort of structural social problems that keep people from succeeding.
Well, that's going to have to be the last word today, gentlemen. Our guests have been Meir Rinde, investigative reporter with Billy Penn at WHYY, Tom Lehman, political reporter with WGAL TV, Lancaster, and Carter Walker, reporter with Votebeat, Pennsylvania. Thank you all so much for being here. That's it for Journalist Roundtable. I'm Ellen Franz. Thanks for watching.